Hi everyone. Have you ever wondered what the long-term impacts of fertilization at the time of planting with RTI Teabag fertilizer are? If you've ever been curious about that, you're going to want to watch this video, so stay tuned. Hi again everyone, I'm Darius Bucher and I'm the owner of Integral Forest Management, and I'm also the Canadian rep for RTI, the makers of Teabag Fertilizer. So the site that I'm on today is one that I really wish that I could bring everyone out to. But unfortunately I know everybody's pretty busy and travel and all the rest of it makes that impossible. But the good news is I can try and bring it to you on video. I know it's not exactly the same, but it should be good. The site that I'm on is a trial that was established way back in 2003, and that would have been the year of the McClure fire. The location of the trial is just between Little Fort and Clearwater in the IDF MW2, so we're just getting transitional with the drier areas of the ICH. This trial was established way back under the Forest Investment Account days. And now this will be the 19th year since it was established, 19th growing season. So it's pretty neat to come back and see how it's developed over time. I've been in a really privileged position in the sense that not only did I establish the trial, but I've been back here every couple of years to remeasure it. So I've been able to see how this stand has developed over time. Now this trial is actually, there's just so many things to unpack. There was a lot of messages that came out of it over the years, but one of the things that I really learned was the fact that trees don't really start to express themselves until year 5 and beyond. Doing trials that only last a year or two, they're way too short. Being able to do this one for the longer term really gives me an excellent indication of how these stands are going to develop over time. Now this particular trial had 4 components to it. It was, not only did we have an aspect of it where we were taking a look at how fertilization at the time of planting could help establish a stand, but the other component of it was combined with site prep, which in this case would have been stumping. So we had one control, which was planted as is. We had an area that was planted as is and Teabag fertilized. We had an area that was just stumped and it was not fertilized at all. And then fourth, of course, one that was stumped and fertilized. So we were able to compare the different treatments over these past 19 years, and it's really interesting what we were able to find. So we're going to go over that today. Okay, so I just thought I'd show you a tree that was planted as is. This one happens to be a control tree that was not fertilized, but it just happened to be a good spot where you can clearly see, but there's not, we tried, I mean, before this trial was established, the entire site was stumped, but our choice of microsite would have been the sites that are in between the loose stumped ground. It would have been trying to find the flat spots that weren't impacted by the stumping at all. So we had to kind of work around it a little bit. But here's just an example of a control tree that would have been planted as is. Okay, so here's an example of a tree that was fertilized at the time of planting. Sorry, I forgot to mention that the trees were fertilized with the RTI Bio-pak 1686. This is an older fertilizer that we have significantly improved upon since its initial inception. So it's no longer available, but when we were using these tea bags, we had to still put them in a separate hole. So it's not using the newest technology. But at any rate, this one would have also been planted as is. It was not site prepped. So what did we learn in the trial as far as fertilization at the time of planting with regards to just planting as is on a site? Well, the one thing about planting as is, there's an awful lot of variation in your microsite. And we learned that if the one thing that is going to be the biggest benefit to the establishment of your seedling is the foundation, which is always your microsite. So when we compared the fertilized trees versus the controls, there's not really any difference in their size, whether it be their volume, their height, their diameter. They're all pretty similar. And you would think, well, there's obviously no benefit to the fertilizer. But that's simply not the case, as you've seen in other videos that I produced. It really comes down to what is the quality of your microsite. And if you happen to get control trees that are on site, that are microsites that happen to be better than the ones that are fertilized, then you're going to end up getting the biggest benefit from your microsite. So fertilizer is not going to rescue you from a bad microsite. And this is definitely a site where there was a ton of variation, not only in the quality of soil, but also with regards to brush competition at the time of planting. And that would have dictated more than anything the performance of the seedlings. Okay, so now I'm standing beside a stump tree, or a tree that was planted into prepped ground, but was not fertilized at the time of planting. So I just thought before I proceed along, I just go over a little bit about the site prep here and how it was conducted. So of course the main reason that stumping was done here was to be able to mitigate the effects of armillaria root disease. And yes, there is definitely armillaria present on site. And you could see it every once in a while knock out a tree here or there at the beginning stages of the trial when they were young. But now that the trees are older and much more healthy and vigorous, I wasn't seeing armillaria knocking out trees any longer. So they're obviously able to ward off the disease, and I guess you could say perhaps the stumping helped that. But the stumping also provided an awful lot of other benefits. The first benefit, of course, would have been it loosened the soil when the stump came out. So loosening the soil here was really important because soils can be quite compacted throughout this site. So loosening the soil, when you're putting your seedling into the ground, of course, it allows it to get its roots out and to penetrate and to start accessing the soil a lot quicker, getting moisture. Not only that, loosening the soils also helps, moisture penetrate when it does rain. It's not just running off. And the other thing that was happening during the stumping is we were getting some mixing of organic matter. And of course, most importantly, and as we were talking about in the last site where I was looking at raw planted trees that had been fertilized, the stumping set back the vegetation competition and gave the tree an opportunity to grow out in the light and to be able to get ahead of its competition. So that certainly made a difference in that way too. As far as microsite selection is concerned, I know in some of the other videos where I'm looking at very dry sites in the IDF, this is a much sort of wetter version of the IDF where we're once again transitional with the ICH. So moisture isn't as much of a limiting factor. And at that time period, we were using the edge of the hole, I guess you could say, where the stump was pulled out of, where the roots could make contact with organic matter and had the best access to site nutrients. That would have been our chosen spot. So that's what we were thinking about. We weren't thinking about shading trees or anything like that back at that particular time. So what did stumping do as far as results are concerned? So looking at things at age 17 and looking at the volumes between a tree that had been planted without being fertilized at the time of planting versus one that was just raw planted and also not fertilized, you get an 8% bump in volume. So you get a little bit. It definitely shows that it made a difference for the growth pattern of the tree. I also, now that these trees are tall enough, for the past few years, I've been able to take the measurements that I've taken and take the data and put it onto site index curves and try and project into the future what the volumes of the site are going to be. So when we just stumped and we raw planted it, if I take it to year 50, when approximately the maximum annual increment is, around the time when you really optimally biologically want to harvest your stand, we're looking at a 3.7% gain in volume. So I know it sounds funny because the percentages go down. The absolute volume gain is of course increasing over time, but percentages go down because the relative size of the larger trees as they get older. So that's what's going on there. So we end up with an overall 337 meters cubed per hectare by stumping without fertilizing at the time of planting versus 325. So 12 cubic meters gain in volume. So not too bad. One of the things that I also took a look at, it's interesting going back over data over time, is stumping provided another benefit that I wasn't even considering at the time. But I looked at the data for year 11 and year 15, which would have been the years 2013 and 2017. And I see a couple of anomalies of this bump in height growth of the stump tree, or the trees that have been planted into the stump ground. And I was just like looking like, what's going on with this? I could never figure it out until I went and I tied it back to weather. And those years when we were seeing those little extra height bumps, it was a result of weather patterns in May of those years. 2013 wasn't really known as a very dry year, nothing that stands out in anybody's mind. But the thing about it was really hot and dry early in May when the leaders were extending. So having the hole around the tree helped capture moisture from the melting snow and hold it there longer so the tree could take advantage of it longer into the season versus the ones that were just raw planted. 2017, of course, started out very wet in May, but then about mid-May, everything started to turn off and it caught the trees on the back half of their leader extension. And so having that extra moisture around for longer also benefited them at that time. Usually, one more thing about site prep, it usually benefits the tree for like 2 or 3 years. By then, the soils are going back to their regular bulk density, brush is establishing, and the trees are starting to be impacted more of the site around them than anything else. So anyways, I hope that helps explain what was going on with the trees that were planted into stump ground without being fertilized at the time of planting. Okay, now I'm standing in front of what I would consider my favorite trees. I'm not going to lie to you there. But these are trees that were fertilized at the time of planting with the Bio-paks and planted into the site prepared or the stumped ground in the best microsite possible. So what does that mean? Well, as we looked at before, when we were comparing raw planted trees, because of the brush competition taking over the way that it did, fertilizing at the time of planting didn't make a difference. But in the stump ground where it's been prepared, and the seedling is given an optimum microsite and the brush is set back, now the tree is able to take advantage of the fertilizer. And as a result of that, the volume gains are substantial. So once again, going back to the trees that were planted in stumped ground as controls without fertilizer, there was an 8% gain in volume at the end of 17 years. Well, at the end of 17 years for these guys, this bumped up to 31%. So we're talking roughly 4 times the volume gain by fertilizing at the time of planting, because the seedling was able to take advantage of the fertilizer because of its positioning. So what does that mean for rotation, biological rotation at age 50? Well, that one's really interesting, because once again, going back to the trees that were planted without fertilizer in the stump ground, they had a 3.7% gain, or 12 cubic meters per hectare. Well, that bumped up to 51 cubic meters per hectare. So we're talking huge gains in volume. We're talking 388 cubic meters per hectare gross volume. I need to clarify that it's gross volume that I'm looking at, versus 337 cubic meters per hectare for the trees that were planted in the stump ground, so without fertilizer. So we're talking huge volume gains. And so what is the reason for that? Why would it continue on like that when the fertilizer in the Teabag is used up after the first growing season? Well, this is essentially how it works. The tree does not, or the fertilizer itself, it's in too small of an amount to change the site index. That's not what it does. But what it does do is it allows the tree to capture the site better than it could have on its own. So because it has nutrients that are easily available to it, it uses it to make a bigger root system and a bigger crown. The bigger crown, of course, produces more sugar, which increases its ability to feed that bigger root system, which draws up more nutrients the next year and produces a bigger crown, which produces more sugar, which the next year is able to feed the root system, which is able to feed the crown, and on the cycle goes. So you will see over time, when you look at the data, the spread in volume between trees fertilized and those not fertilized is continuing to widen over time. And it's continuing to widen to this day. These are 2 separate sets of trees. And this year, I'm really excited because now that I have a drone, I'm able to get up and over top of the canopy and take a look at the trees from the top and see whether the crowns are different, whether what I've just described to you persists. And taking a look at it from what I've seen so far, it most certainly does. And it will there's nothing that's going to stop that from happening, and it will persist right through to rotation. Of course, now bringing it home, what does this mean for you, the silviculture forester that has a silviculture budget that you need to work for? And I know many obligations only go to free growing. And really what it comes down to is how can I get my site to free growing with the least cost as possible? Well, in this site in particular, by fertilizing at the time of planting and stumping, this block was all fertilized at the time of planting and stump, which is around this trial. They were able to declare free growing in 5 years there was a little bit of a brushing program that needed to happen to clean up a couple of hot spots, but for the most part, this block was able to get away on its own. So being able to get rid of your liability, not have to deal with brush way down the road, spending $300 or $400 a hectare upfront fertilizing at the time of planting, then having to do a massive brushing program costing $1,000 per hectare plus, it's huge. You also don't have to track the site for as long and keep administering treatments. So that's the good news about that. Now, if you're on a site where you have an area-based tenure like a community forest or a woodlot, I wouldn't consider not fertilizing at the time of planting, because you're going to get the reward of the volume gains. And this is not the only site that I'm monitoring that is showing that over time, if you position the tree, and this is, once again, this is the critical part, is positioning the tree in a spot that it can take advantage of the nutrients, you are going to get a bump in volume by rotation length, or vice versa, even change rotation length, so by shortening it. So those are the benefits that you can achieve by fertilizing at the time of planting. Okay, hold on to your hats for this one. I'm really hoping that I can explain this clearly and explain it well in an understandable fashion. But one of the things that somebody asked me to do was, what if you compared broadcast fertilization at age 15, just before canopy closure, with fertilization at the time of planting? What kind of volume gains would you get doing that versus fertilizing at the time of planting? Well, I did a run using Tipsy, and this is based on Tipsy estimates, not on reality. I didn't do it out in the field. Is we would gain 8 cubic meters per hectare by broadcast fertilization. Now, once again, fertilization at the time of planting, combined with good site prep and putting the tree in the right microsite, bought us 51 cubic meters per hectare of volume gain. So we're talking 6 times the amount by fertilizing at the time of planting versus coming in and broadcasting later, just before canopy closure. So what does this tell me? Well, what it tells me is the fact that there is no more critical moment in a tree's life than when it is put into the ground. That is the time when its trajectory is set. And I can tell you, based on measuring number of trials over the years, that once a tree is on a certain trajectory, it's going to stick on that trajectory right through to rotation. It's very hard to get it off it. So you're going to get a much bigger benefit by fertilizing when a tree is planted than trying to get it going 15 years down the road. So very important lesson to learn. The other thing to consider is the fact that fertilizing by broadcast with a helicopter, you're looking at, it's kind of funny, there's a helicopter going in the background now. This will help you remember it, but you're going to be using 400 to 500 kilograms per hectare of urea in order to get the job done. Fertilizing at the time of planting, we're talking 15 kilograms per hectare. So a much, much, much lower footprint by fertilizing at the time of planting. The other thing to note is when you're fertilizing by broadcast, because you're using uncoated nutrients like your urea, that fertilizer, when it hits the ground running. And as a result, it means that there is very little uptake from the tree. Trees are not designed to have a big shock of nutrients all at one time. Trees like to feed slowly throughout the growing season. They're eating bit by bit over time. So having a big shock to the system like that means most of that fertilizer is not getting into your tree. In fact, some of it's volatilizing into the air, not a huge amount, but a little bit, A little bit's being leached away. Some of it ends up in your competing vegetation. But what they found more than anything is that most of that fertilizer ends up being locked up by microbes in the organic layers of your soil. Only 10 to 20% of the nutrients actually end up in your tree. The other 80% are ending up somewhere else. So that's something that you need to consider. Now, some people would say, well, that's fine. If most of them are locked up by nutrients on the site, then maybe it'll feed the trees over time. But once those nutrients become locked up in the organic matter by microbes, that nutrient becomes part of the overall site pool. And it's released extremely slowly. So the amount that's being released each year becomes minuscule, it's negligible, it doesn't do anything as far as bumping up volume production in your tree. All the volume production that you're getting is through nutrient uptake that happened when the fertilizer was applied year one broadcast. Now, fertilization at the time of planting, using controlled release fertilizer, putting the nutrients in the soil where the roots can have immediate access to them. There was one study that I saw that came across my desk. People were using controlled release fertilizer and comparing it to broadcast just to get seedlings going. So we're not talking the amounts that I was talking about before. But they found that they could accomplish the same thing by applying 10% of the amount of controlled release fertilizer than by trying to broadcast fertilizer on the ground with no coatings to control the nutrient release. So it's a much more effective, more environmentally friendly program. The other thing to consider is the fact that adding a fertilizer program later on in the rotation of a stand, now that's a whole nother program to plan for. It's another entry. It's got a whole bunch of additional costs. Fertilization at the time of planting, you're already there with your planters. You're hardly adding anything to your cost in comparison. So it's much more effective. So given the overall volume benefits over time, and given the fact that it's a much smaller environmental impact, fertilization at the time of planting in a way which is beneficial to your tree, fertilization at the time of planting with controlled release fertilizers like we have with our PHP coatings is what you would want to be doing. Okay, so now I'd like to talk a little bit about site index. And I was mentioning a little bit before when comparing fertilized and unfertilized trees. So what are some actual numbers? Well, if we were to look at just the Beck estimation for this site, the site index would be 21 meters at age 50. So I guess that's not too bad. But it's really interesting. Even the trees that were planted as is, without fertilizer, are on a trajectory to be at 25.7. So that's much greater than even what the Beck estimates are. Now, when we did some stumping and added to that, we ended up increasing the site index by 0.1. So we took it from 25.7 to 25.8. But by adding stumping and fertilizing at the time of planting, we increased the site index by 1.6. So we're all the way up to 27.3. So that's basically the trajectory that these trees that are fertilized at the time planting in stump ground are on. Now, as I mentioned before, we haven't changed the site index of this site, but the trees are on trajectories as if they are on a different site index, which we will consider to go to rotation. And the simple reason for that, once again, is because they have been able to capture the site. So that tells me is that the site indexes of the sites that we're reforesting are much greater than what we're getting out of them. We aren't getting the full potential out of them. In order to get the full potential of the site index of a site, it really comes down to how you establish the seedling at the time of planting. The time of planting is what's going to set that tree on the trajectory for its whole life up until rotation. Just one thing that I'd like to add about site index. As we all know, site index, when you're putting a tree on a yield curve to see the productivity of a site, it's based on the height of the trees, not the diameter. Well, something interesting about fertilizing at the time of planting, because the trees have a bigger crown, they are producing more wood. You are going to see a bigger increase, a bigger bump in the diameter of the tree than you are in height. Trees will always put on height. They're trying to stay ahead of their competition. But what the tree wants to do is to sequester carbon and produce wood for you. So you want to give it that opportunity. So interestingly enough, what we did, just for fun, is to take the diameters that we were getting and measuring on this site and comparing it to those diameters that were expected for that site index in Tipsy. And what we found was that the diameters that we were measuring were substantially greater. And this is in my report too. You can take a look at it for yourself. Than what Tipsy was estimating. Now this is a big deal because we're basing rotation length on height of trees based on volume or diameter estimates that Tipsy has based on natural stands. But I can tell you, by fertilizing at the time of planting, you could be shortening rotation lengths not just by a few years because of height, but maybe even more than that because the volume is so much greater because the diameters of your trees are much greater faster. So that's something that's really important to consider. Okay, I just thought I'd come out of the forest and into the sun. It's certainly a lot easier to deal with light out here. And it's a much nicer backdrop. But at any rate, one of the things I just wanted to mention was the fact that year 17 I also did some destructive sampling. And you can see pictures and results of that in my report. But I wanted to see what was going on at the top of the tree. I was wanting to see whether the bigger tops actually did persist. In other words, a bigger crown producing more biomass. And sure enough, what I thought was happening was definitely occurring. There is I noticed bigger crown and more growth happening at the top of the tree for the fertilized trees than those that weren't fertilized. One of the interesting things that meant is not just more volume growth over time, but also less stem taper. It was a more consistent stem. So I think that's also going to be beneficial to people as well, in the sense that rotation length is partly to do with the taper of the stem. So by being able to reduce that could also help mitigate the length of rotation. All right, so just to sum up everything that we went through, found this one to be a little bit complicated just from the fact there's an awful lot going on and there's a whole lot of numbers going on out there. You know, to really digest this information, it's a really good idea, and I'm more than happy to do this, is to send along the 17-year trial results. In that is all the data summarized, going through differences in height, diameter, volume projections, even some destructive sampling type stuff. Looking at the weather, there's a whole bunch of different aspects, and it does take some time to wade through it, but boy, the lessons are extremely valuable if you have that time. The big take-home messages that I'd like to leave with you, and I hope that you picked up, is that fertilization at the time of planting is extremely effective for establishing your stand. But in order to do that, you must take into account your other site limiting factors, whether they be soils, competing vegetation, whatever it is that could be hindering your trees from establishing and being able to take advantage of the fertilizer. They need to be addressed. Sometimes you need to site prep, sometimes you don't. But whatever you do, you definitely need to be thinking about your other site limiting factors to get the most out of the product. However, when you learn how to utilize this tool effectively and to put it in conjunction with things like the other site activities that you're doing, you can end up with an extremely powerful result, as I've shown you. Not only does it help your trees establish quicker, get through competing vegetation, that kinds of things at the very beginning, and most people were doing this treatment as a result just to get to free growing without having to do other interventions. But based on the data that I'm seeing and the projections that I'm running through Tipsy, it is going to also shorten your rotation length. So that's a benefit as well, especially in a time when we're looking at timber fall downs as far as volume is concerned. So fertilization at the time of planting can be extremely effective for giving you a whole suite of benefits. The other thing to also take note of is the fact that the establishment phase of your tree is the most critical time period in its life. There is no better time. You can try and intervene by fertilizing later on, but you're never going to get the same effect as if you fertilize at the time of planting. The growth trajectory that you set your tree on right from the very beginning is the one that it's going to follow. So take that into an account and how to get the most out of the fertilizer. Once again, if any of you have any questions or you'd like a copy of the report, please feel free to contact me at integralfm@telus.net. Thanks for watching.